Shalom, friends. This is a wonderful opportunity to be together again for a Chidush webinar co-sponsored with the Ruach Chidush, Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality, with the J-Plan, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Actions Network. And I have noticed already that David Light, who is one of our co-chairs, and I assume that Peter Buxbaum and Mark Enshen may join us as well. The American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, and I'm always delighted to see Steve Greenwald, the past president of the American Association and a great friend of Chidush and a great partner in our endeavors. I mentioned before that this webinar is unprecedented. I attribute it to our speaker, our beloved Elliot Dorff, that attracted 188 people registered. That's really unprecedented. Not all of them are already online, and I know that some have contacted me expressing regret that even though they registered, they have a conflict, and others who have contacted me who said they would have loved to be with us, but they have a conflict, and some are here in Israel in programs. In any case, this program has attracted an amazing number of diverse people from different denominations, different professions, colleagues, rabbis, attorneys, activists, communal leaders, etc. And this is all wonderful for a topic that is on everybody's mind this time, whether Jewish or not Jewish. And I just want, before I turn over the microphone to Elliot, I want to remind you and urge you to also sign up to, in 2 weeks on the 25th, we will have Professor Noya Rimalt, a law professor from Haifa University. Some of you may recognize the name Rimalt. She's the daughter of Elimelech Rimalt, who was the leader of the Liberal Party in Israel. Yes, there was a time when there was a Liberal Party in Israel. And I think a deputy speaker of the Knesset and the minister, etc., a highly regarded individual. His daughter, Professor Noya Rimalt, is highly regarded in her own right, and she is the co-director of the Center for Law, Gender, and Social Policy, and she will speak about legal aspects of the abortion ruling, and there'll be a twist to her presentation, because I'm sure many of you are proud of the fact that Israel's laws and policies are far more liberal in this regard than what the American Supreme Court has turned out to seek. But she will tell you that it's a more complicated picture. Yes, the practice is far more liberal, but there is more to be desired if women's equality is to be respected. So join us in 2 weeks, same day, same time, for Professor Rimalt's presentation of the legal aspects and some comparison between the American state of the law and the Israeli policies and state of the law regarding abortion. And without any further introduction, Professor Elliot Dorff, a leading scholar in the field of Jewish law and ethics, and a great mensch for all who know him.
Well, thank you. I'm going to, the Jewish Federation Council here asked me to write a brief thing about abortion and Jewish law in comparison to, in response to what the Supreme Court did. It's a 2-paragraph thing, so I'm going to read that to you because that will summarize where I am on this issue, and then I'm going to come back and then spell out some pieces of it, and then I really want to leave most of the time for you to ask me whatever questions you have. Jewish law is much more nuanced on abortion than either the Catholic position or Roe v. Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court decision that made it a matter of a woman's choice until viability. The Catholic view classifies a fertilized embryo as a full human being, but that mistakes the potential for the actual. for we have ample evidence that somewhere between 75 to 80% of fertilized eggs in women's bodies miscarry, most in the first month of pregnancy, often before the woman knows that she is pregnant. The Talmud, based on Exodus 21, verses 22 to 25, and undoubtedly on the miscarriages that the rabbis witnessed, classifies the developing embryo as simply liquid during the first 40 days of pregnancy and like the thigh of its mother from then until birth. It is only when the head, or in a breech birth, a major part of the fetus's body emerges that it becomes a full human being. Consequently, feticide is not the same as homicide in Jewish law. At the same time, the embryo and later the fetus is a developing human being, and we do have a duty to procreate, an obligation that is especially important to remember in this era when Jews are facing a major demographic crisis. So abortion is required when the life or physical or mental health of the woman is at stake, permitted according to many but not all rabbis when there is an elevated risk to the woman over that of normal pregnancy, or when the fetus will suffer from a lethal or devastating disease. But by and large, Jewish law would prohibit abortion when done for other reasons, largely as a function of frustration of the duty to procreate, and also the risk involved in the abortion procedure itself. In that way, Jewish law is less permissive than Roe v. Wade is. Jewish law, though, however interpreted, should not be the basis of American law, and neither should the stance of any other religion. This goes back to Thomas Jefferson, who asserted that when Americans overwhelmingly agree on a moral issue, for example, prohibition of murder or theft and rape, and positive duties to pay taxes and educate your children, the state may enforce the moral stance as law. But when Americans disagree about a moral issue, the government should leave it to each citizen to determine what is proper. Abortion clearly fits into the latter category. So the new Supreme Court decision that enables states to prohibit abortion altogether or substantially restrict it violates Jefferson's wise balance of how people of multiple faiths and none can live together amicably and productively. As such, it is bad for mutual respect among Americans, and the new Supreme Court decision is bad for mutual respect among Americans and American unity. It is also a major blow to the individual liberty that is one important source of American identity and pride. It additionally violates freedom of religion, for in many states abortion will be prohibited in cases in which Jewish law and the stances of many other religions and secular groups would require it or permit it. It effectively establishes the Catholic view of the fetus in violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. For all these reasons, it is a very bad decision. Okay, so let me go back to the beginning and be a little bit more explicit as to what this is all about. The issues involved are not a matter of a dispute as to the biology. As far as I can tell, everybody agrees on the biology of how sperm meets egg, whether it's in a woman's womb or in a petri dish through in vitro fertilization, and that ultimately that if that is in a petri dish cultured for several days and reimplanted in a woman's womb, or if it gets there through sexual intercourse, that then the fetus develops. And we have back to, some of you are old enough to remember that Look magazine back in 1964 published the first pictures of the evolving fetus in a woman's womb. And some of you may have gone to the Body Works exhibit that when it was in Los Angeles, I'm sure it was in other cities as well, where you actually saw miscarried embryos and then later fetuses. By the way, the word embryo is used, it's a zygote, it's a fertilized egg cell when sperm meets egg, and then it's a pre-embryo and then an embryo, and it becomes a fetus roughly in the 4th month when the attachment of the embryo to the uterine wall is much stronger. That's also when pregnant women begin to show, and it's when most couples are begin to tell their friends and family that they're pregnant, and when the danger of miscarriage diminishes. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen, starting in the 4th month. It does, but the vast majority of miscarriages happen in the 1st month, actually, and then the next most in the 2nd month, and the next in the 3rd month, before the evolving embryo is strongly attached to the to the uterus. So the rabbis, of course, did not have sonograms, and they did not know about they certainly didn't have pictures of the embryo. But as I indicated in what I just read to you, they certainly witnessed miscarriages, and so they saw what they looked like. And as a matter of fact, I was on a project for the American Association for the Advancement of Science. This is back in the early 2000s, and we were talking about embryonic stem cell research. And the man who was teaching us was one of the 2 physicians, one at the University of Wisconsin, one at Hopkins. This is the one from Hopkins, who had first isolated embryonic stem cells. And during a coffee break, just because, well, remember, the rabbis say it's simply liquid for the first 40 days, and then like the thigh of its mother thereafter. So the first 40 days counting from where? From when, I mean. The gynecologists count from the last period that the woman had. And that's a 40-week pregnancy, right? That's what most women are used to. Geneticists count from the moment of conception, which is usually in the middle of the menstrual month. So it really, the actual human involvement of the human embryo is really 38 weeks. The rabbis were counting from the first period that she missed. So their 40 days is really 54 days of gestation. So I asked this professor at Hopkins, what would an embryo look like if it miscarried around 54 days of gestation? And he said it would look like a thigh. And I almost dropped my coffee, frankly, because I said to him, you realize that that's exactly what the rabbis say that an embryo looks like. So why did you tell me that? So he said, because if an embryo miscarriages around 54 days of gestation, it will have a bone. That's when it begins to get a bone and flesh and hair. And since it would come from the groin area of the body, I said it was like a thigh, which is exactly the image that the rabbis use. So normally I would not tell you to trust rabbinic science, but in this particular case, they actually did get it right, that the embryo does develop over a period of time. And what that led to in the Jewish tradition is several things. Number one, already in the Mishnah, in Ohalot, the rabbis say that if a woman is having difficulty in childbirth, then you not only may, but must go into the womb and dismember the fetus in order to save the life of the woman. Because they take that verse in Exodus, those verses in Exodus 21, very seriously, to say that the woman is a full-fledged human being, but and therefore her life must be preserved, even if it's at the expense of this developing life, which is not a full-fledged human being until born. And then, by the way, what happens if what happens if the head emerges and they still are having difficulty getting the child out of the womb? Well, then it would be then it's the usual rules of triage, namely that whichever one of them you have the better chance of saving, you should save. Now remember, this is all before safe C-sections. Because it's called the cesarean section, because at least according to the stories, Julius Caesar was delivered by a C-section. And there were such C-sections for thousands of years, but when doctors did them, it was because otherwise both the fetus and the mother would die. And since but if they did the C-section, the mother would almost always die because she would bleed out, or she would become infected. As a matter of fact, when I was born in 1943, I just turned 79. You don't have to do the math. In 1945, my mother was pregnant again, and the baby detached from the fallopian, well, from the tube, right, from the in the 6th month of pregnancy, and they did not do a C-section at that time because in 1945, even though antibiotics were already available, they did not know how to use them in doing a C-section. It's really only the late 40s, early 50s, 1950s, that C-sections became fairly safe for women to do. Now, of course, in modern times, when a woman would be having difficulty in childbirth, then a C-section would be done. And God willing, both the mother and the child would survive. But this was not true until 70 years ago, roughly. So what the rabbis were doing was taking that seriously, namely that the woman is a full-fledged human being and has to be saved. Therefore, if her life or health is at stake, an abortion must be done. Then there are cases in which her life is threatened beyond that, beyond the risk of normal pregnancy. For example, if she has diabetes. Then under those circumstances, she may decide to take the risk, but then she really needs, from the point of view of Jewish law, she needs to get more prenatal care than what normally happens in pregnancy. But she may decide, according to Jewish law, to abort because she does not want to take the elevated risk that carrying a baby would have for her over that of the risk, of the degree of risk in normal pregnancy for other women. And more recently, when we now have sonograms and it started with amniocentesis in the 1970s, and then chorionic villus sampling. In other words, we know much more now about the fetus than our ancestors did just 3 generations ago. So increasingly, rabbis across the spectrum, but not as much so in the Orthodox world, would also allow at least an abortion if the fetus is going to have a lethal genetic disease, something like Tay-Sachs or familial dysautonomia, or will have a very debilitating disease, such as Fragile X. Then many rabbis would agree that abortion would be permitted under those circumstances, some directly on the basis of the status of the fetus, more on a kind of indirect way, based on the mental health of the woman. So when you in times past, when rabbis would talk about this, sometimes they would talk about it as a degree of the mental health of the women. So Rabbi David Feldman, alav shalom, who wrote probably the book, I would say, on abortion and birth control, that was his doctoral dissertation at New York University in 1968, and it has been republished under several. It was originally just abortion and Jewish law. Then it was birth control, something else on abortion and Jewish law. Anyway, it was republished several times. His position was that if a woman comes up to me and says, for example, I'm going to have, I had testing and it's clear that that I'm going to have a Down's child, and that's going to be terrible for the child. Then he would say to her, that's not a reason to abort, because first of all, you don't know whether it's going to be terrible for the child, and you're talking about the child, you're not talking about yourself. But if the same woman came to him and said that I'm going to have a Down's child and this is driving me up a wall, that would be a reason to abort. Now I have to say, I really knew and loved David Feldman. He was a wonderful man and in all kinds of ways and really smart. But this, I think, is just a disingenuous position, right? Because if that's really what you want to say, then just teach her to say the right thing, right, in order to produce the permission to abort. I mean, I think that if a woman came to me and said, I'm going to have a Down's child and I'm really worried about that. So I would say to her, go and talk to other couples, 3 other couples who are raising Down's children, and find out what it's like, so that you don't make the decision on the basis of ignorance, but rather make it on the basis of knowledge about what it's like to raise a Down's child or any other genetic disease, and then decide whether you want to abort or not. So, I mean, I do think that this mental health understanding of reasons to abort is a very important one. especially now that we know much more about the nature of the fetus before it's born. This, by the way, the mental health thing came about originally with a rabbi in the late 1800s, long before abortion was safe, in a case in which the woman was impregnated through an act of incest. And she told the rabbi that if I have to deliver this child, I'm going to be ostracized from my family, my community. I literally am going to go insane. And on the basis of that, the rabbi allowed the abortion, even though it really wasn't safe in the late 1800s. So this mental health reason is important in Jewish law, but you have to be careful. It doesn't, for most rabbis at least that have written about this, it doesn't extend to, I'd really rather not have a child for whatever reason, economic or enough already or something like that. That's a very good reason to use birth control. And maybe even the morning after pill. And maybe even RU486, which is usable until about 2 months into the term, into the pregnancy. But beyond that, you really need to sort of decide. You need to take some responsibility. Judith Jarvis Thompson, who was not Jewish as far as I know, wrote an article about abortion back in the 70s. Which gets republished in every anthology of bioethics that I have ever used to teach. And what she points out is that which she distinguishes between a reasonable Samaritan, a good Samaritan, and a splendid Samaritan, right? A reasonable Samaritan is one who, let's say, they got pregnant and wanted to have a child, and therefore did not use birth control, but in the middle of the pregnancy, for some reason, decide that they don't want the child anymore. She would say that a reasonable Samaritan would continue on with it nevertheless. If they used birth control and really did not want to have a child, but got pregnant anyway, then it's a good Samaritan to continue on with the pregnancy, in her view, right? If she got pregnant through an act of incest or adultery or something like that, or rape, then it would be a splendid Samaritan, as she puts it, to carry through with the pregnancy and probably give up the child for adoption because she probably doesn't want to be reminded of the rape or the incest. So that was Judith Jarvis Thompson back in the 1970s. So I mean, I do think that one needs to be aware of the fact that, at least in the Jewish tradition, remember the right, and as a matter of fact, the obligation of a woman to abort her child if it's going to be a danger to her life or health, should not be mistaken to be an understanding that within the Jewish tradition, a woman should abort whenever she wants to for any reason. Because you have to remember that the other side of it is that in Jewish law, there is an obligation to procreate, which doesn't exist in American law. And the obligation to procreate is the first of the commandments in the Bible, chapter 1 of Genesis, pru or vu, right? And the rabbis then later, as their wont, they try to determine, well, what exactly is the nature of that obligation, and they determine that it means to have 2 children, right? The laws according to Beit Hillel, a boy and a girl. Just as we're supposed to follow God's lead, and God created the first human being, male and female. God created them. Again, Genesis chapter 1, right? So if you have 10 boys or 10 girls, you still have not fulfilled your obligation to procreate, at least in theory. But Rabbi Castle Abelson and I wrote a rabbinic ruling for the conservative movement, saying that really does not matter, because even if within a family it turns out that they're only children of one gender, over the course in the entire community, they more or less balance out. But still, what we are facing today is not only, first of all, we lost a third of our numbers in the Holocaust. We were about 18 million before the Holocaust and about 12 million thereafter. Counting everybody who claims to be Jewish, I'm not talking about halachic definitions here. We have somewhere between 13 and 14 million Jews in the world. But the reproductive rate among American Jews is about 1.8. And if you don't count the Orthodox, it's about 1.5. And in order to simply reproduce yourself, you have to have a 2.2 to 2.3 reproductive rate. So we are literally killing ourselves off as a people by not reproducing. And some of that is a function of the fact that we Jews believe a lot in education. And the American statistics are that roughly 70% of 18-year-olds in America finish high school. And what percentage of Jews do you think 18 years old finish high school? It's actually 100%, because if they don't, their parents kill them. No, not really. It's about 92% though, as opposed to 70%. And then a very high percentage of Jews go on to finish a college degree, and then many of them beyond that in terms of graduate programs. That's good for education, but it's terrible for procreation, because we human beings were designed to procreate in our late teens and 20s. Up to about age 27, it doesn't matter, but from 27 to 35, you already get a 30% infertility rate, where infertility is defined as the couple is not using birth control and they're not able to get pregnant within a year. That's one form of infertility. The other is that they are able to get pregnant, but there's a series of miscarriages. And so there's a 30% of infertility for couples between 27 and 35. From 35 to 40, that skyrockets, and you get a much higher rate of genetic problems. I read one article that said from 40 to 42, you have a 9% chance of taking home a healthy baby. And let me hasten to add here, this is not only a woman's problem, this is also a man's problem, because men's fertility diminishes as they age. Sperm counts go down. Usually that's not the problem, but sperm, because when a man ejaculates, he ejaculates millions of sperm, but sperm counts do go down. And as a man ages, but more importantly, sperm motility goes down. That is the ability to swim up the vaginal canal and ultimately impregnate a woman through the sperm entering the egg. Sperm motility goes down, and sperm gets misshapen as a man gets older, so that even if the sperm gets to the egg, it may not be able to penetrate the egg and make the woman pregnant. So this is a man's problem as much as it is a woman's problem. And in women, the hormones diminish as time goes on. And by the way, in men, there's also erectile dysfunction that happens as men get older. So I mean, this is a man's problem as much as it is a woman's problem. And as a community, it's a major problem for us. That means, first of all, that we have to be much kinder to Jews by choice than some communities have been in the past. And we have to try to help our young couples financially with the burden of having children, because that is very often an issue that they raise, even if they get married in their late 20s or 30s. And by the way, unfortunately, a lot of Jewish couples are not marrying until their mid 30s or later, and then inevitably end up in places like my office asking how can they keep their marriage together when they assume that they're going to be able to have children, and then they can't. It causes major tensions within a marriage, especially for young couples who expected that they would be able to get pregnant whenever they wanted to. So that's the other side of it, the obligation to procreate and the really high rate of infertility among young Jews, because they postpone marriage and trying to have children too long. So on the one hand, we want to make sure that abortion is permitted in the secular law, so that when it's required in Jewish law or permitted in Jewish law, it's available, safe and effective, right? On the other hand, we want to make sure that young Jews, know that they shouldn't wait too long to look for a mate. They shouldn't wait too long to get married if they find one. And I regularly tell students in USY, right, pick a college where there are a lot of Jews, not only because you're more likely to find a Jewish studies course if you want one, major in physics or whatever you want, and also you're more likely to find a Shabbat meal and holiday celebrations, but also you might find a mate while you're in college. And if you find one, don't hesitate to get married and begin to have children, because the pressures of your first job are going to be, if anything, worse than the pressures of graduate school. This sermon I can give at 2 a.m. if you wake me up, because I've given it so often. But but I'm proud to say that a number of couples have come up to me many years later and said, "You're the reason why we have our third child," right? Or even our first child, right? So I mean, that's the other side of this whole thing, right? Namely, yes, we want liberal abortion laws on a state level, but within the Jewish community, we really want to also try to help young couples find each other. J-date is terrific, or whatever they're using, but we also need, as communities, need to be much more helpful about that, including the financial pieces of that. So those of us who have some money need to donate to day schools, Camp Ramah, all of that, youth programs to try to help young couples give a Jewish education to their children. So all of that, I think, is involved in this. It's not just abortion or not abortion. It's frankly the future of the Jewish community. Okay, I'm going to stop here and take whatever questions you have.
All right. So first of all, thank you. And we'll thank you at the end as well.
Sure.
You have provided us with a wider prism than just looking at the Jewish tradition and Jewish law, which is fascinating. And of course, there's already a note about that, but I'll ask it in a minute. So let me pose the first question, and those who want to pose additional questions to Professor Dorff can do it. So we labeled it traditional liberal views, positions regarding the Jewish tradition on abortion. So I hate to put you on the spot, we didn't discuss it. But since there are rabbis of different denominations and activists from different denominations, can you give us sort of a very rough cut of where the different denominations are on the question of abortion, knowing that it is not the case that one position for one denomination? That's so correct. Can you just give us a sense of what, yeah.
Right. So, I mean, well, let me just say, as far as I know, everybody across the spectrum would say that if a woman's life is at stake, then an abortion is required. I think from Haredi to Reform, or to secular for that matter, would say that that's the case. That if her life is at stake, no question about it. If her health is at stake, let's say that she is in danger of losing a kidney as a result of this, or she is in danger of diabetes, running rampant in her body, or she is in danger of, I don't know, losing sight or losing hearing or something like that, right? I mean, there are all kinds of possibilities here. Then some would say, even within the Orthodox world, that that's a reason. In other words, if her health is at stake as opposed to her life, some would say that's a reason to abort. Others would say not. And within the Orthodox world, there would be fewer among the Orthodox that would say that mental health issues, like like, for example, she was raped. Now, if the woman is raped, I mean, that's a terrible thing. Let's just say that straight out, okay? But if you're simply talking biologically, then becoming pregnant and carrying a fetus through to the 9 months, having been raped, is no more dangerous to her than if she got pregnant through consensual sex. So if you're talking about her physical danger, it's no greater than if she had gotten pregnant consensually. So therefore, the question becomes, well, is rape a reason to abort in the Orthodox world? Again, this rabbi that I quoted, this Orthodox rabbi that I quoted, modern Orthodox in Germany, actually, in the late 1800s, they would have said yes. And I think some contemporary rabbis would say yes, and others would say no. So I think there's a real spectrum there within the Orthodox world. There is within the conservative world as well. I demonstrated that to you. Rabbi Feldman would say one thing in regard to a woman carrying a Down's child. I would say something else. And within the conservative movement also, there is some variation. But I have to say that the official statement of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the conservative movement reflects what I just mentioned, namely that there are times in which abortion is required, times in which it is permitted, and that in any case secular law should allow it, so that when it is required in Jewish law, it can be done safely and effectively. Within the reform movement, remember, is based on a notion of a very strong sense of individual autonomy. So even then, there's a responsive committee of the Central Conference of American Rabbis that issues responsa, and those are understood within the reform movement as guidance, not governance, to use a phrase from Rabbi Solomon Freehoff from a long time ago. And the guidance within the reform movement is not that a woman should abort just on demand, whatever that means. And by the way, that's a major problem here. I may divorce for any reason whatsoever. Let me put it that way, right? Even within reform response on abortion, they too are interested in procreation, and they too are interested in making sure that abortion is not used, you haven't lived unless you've had an abortion. Nobody says that, right? No woman would ever say that. No men should ever say that. No man should ever say that, right? That's just not the way it is. Whenever, at least in my experience, and I've counseled a lot of couples on this stuff and a lot of single women on this, when a woman decides to abort, it's always with a lot of seriousness. It's not the kind of thing that they do just because they prefer, I don't know, chocolate to vanilla or strawberry. It's not that kind of thing. And so I think you have to take these decisions as seriously as the women who do abort take them, and recognize the seriousness of that, and frankly the moral strength of that. But that said, that doesn't mean that that the decision to abort is something that you decide to do in the same sort of a way as you decide how you're going to observe Shabbat. Right? There's real danger here, both for the woman and for the fetus, and so consequently, even within the reform movement, there's permission to abort, and individuals do whatever they want, and that's what individual autonomy is about, including the way that you do Judaism, right? I mean, this goes back to Eugene Borowitz, the Jewish self, right? The Jewish self has to decide as a Jew how to live out one's Jewish life. And so that would be true for any Jewish couple and Jewish woman who's deciding to abort or not, using the Jewish tradition to the extent that she wants to. But it's then completely up to her. That said, the guidance is to do it only really when there is a very serious reason to do it. Okay.
And is there a main thrust to Reconstructionist or renewal that you know of?
Not that, I haven't. This would be, to the extent that Reconstructionists talk about it, this is primarily David Teutsch, Rabbi David Teutsch, who has written the most within the Reconstructionist movement on these issues. He too has a section on bioethics, and although the method is different than any of the other three movements, the method that at least he would want Reconstructionist Jews to use is somewhat different than that in the Reform movement, the Conservative movement, or the Orthodox world. Nevertheless, he also, as I remember what he wrote about it, this is not something that should be taken lightly. I don't think any woman who does it takes it lightly, frankly. But it's something that really does have to be balanced against the Jewish need for procreation.
David Light, already at the start, asked a factual question. He said you quoted miscarriage rates at 75 to 80%. He was surprised to hear those numbers. Can you recall a source for that statistic?
Yeah. Hold on. Let's see if I have it right here. I thought I had it right here. I don't.
Well, if not, we'll send it as part of the follow-up.
Okay. It was based on hormone studies.
All right.
in terms
I'll
of,
ask you for it, and we were also asked to ask you for the position paper, the brief position paper that you prepared for Federation, and I'm sure
sure.
you'll have, yeah. So we'll send that along with the recording as well.
Okay.
So the other question is sort of an Ipcha Mistabra. Judy Solomon is asking, but Rabbi, fewer children and better education lead to better survival of offspring. Survival is most important for the health of a population, evolution, etc. So just looking at birth rates, it's unlikely that fewer children per family is a risk to the survival of the Jewish people.
Well, I would say not so easy. Because I know of a number of people who grew up in the Orthodox world who are no longer Orthodox. And on the other hand, I know of people who grew up in the Reform world and the conservative world who are much more Jewish than their parents ever were or wanted them to be. So, I mean, I think it is the case that that we do need. I mean, we do need numbers in the end. You can't maintain a Jewish tradition without Jews. I mean, if you want to see a Jewish tradition without Jews, go to the Jewish Museum in Krakow, Poland, right, where you will see the remnants of what was a really vital Jewish community, and now it may be 100 to several hundred people at most, right? And the young people of whom are trying to figure out, just trying to figure out what it means to be Jewish. And by the way, all honor to them, right? I mean, my wife and I happened to be in Krakow on Purim, and we went to the synagogue, the Ramah synagogue there, and it was all old people. And then we went to we were told to go to this particular apartment where they had a number of young couples who were doing a kind of Purim party. They read the Megillah in Polish, which I don't understand, but they read the Megillah in Polish. And they were at least part of it, as far as I know. And they had the Purim party of their own, right? They were shunned by the older people. This was back in 1989 when I was there to teach Catholic seminarians and seminary professors. So I mean, it's I mean, I think you can't assume that you grow up Orthodox, the children are going to be Orthodox. The percentages are probably better. And if then you have to look at the Pew study and all of that kind of stuff as to what happens with this. But I really do think that, I mean, ultimately, we are a very small people to begin with. Let me just give you the statistics. 1/3 of the world's population is Christian, right? 22% of the world's population is Muslim. 0.2% of the world's population is Jewish. That's counting everybody who claims to be Jewish. You need to have just simply a minimal numbers just to be able to sustain yourself numerically, let alone culturally, right? So, I mean, this issue of procreation is not just, that we need to have more Jews. The issue is that in order to be able to continue the tradition, you need to have people who, I mean, unless you want it to be, unless you want studying Judaism in another generation to be like studying ancient Rome, right? Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Well, you certainly drew an interest of the lawyers who hope that you will be able to provide them with both Jewish law perspective and possibly legal perspective on a pending controversial case. So David Light and Steve Greenwald asking about the case in Florida. David is writing, could you comment on the case filed by the congregation Lador Vador in South Florida, challenging the Florida ban on abortions after 15 weeks on the basis of Jewish law, interested in both legal and Jewish perspective?
Well, I hope they succeed, truthfully. And I would hope that other congregations in other red states, that is, in other states that already are prohibiting abortion altogether or vastly restricting it, including my home state, unfortunately, of Wisconsin, that I would hope that Jewish congregations in those states start making the similar suits, either within state law or within federal law, on the basis of freedom of religion. And it's interesting, the current Supreme Court has been very favorable to the freedom of religion part, and basically ignored in this particular case, and also in the case of the football coach who wanted to kneel and have all of his fellow football players kneel with him after the game to pray to Jesus, right? And in both of those cases, they have been very much interested in freedom of religion and not worried at all about the establishment clause in that same amendment. So, I mean, if freedom of religion is the name of the game for the Supreme Court, then I really do hope that congregations in red states band together and create these suits based upon freedom of religion, and see what happens with that.
There were two comments about Jewish public policy. One raised the question somewhat sort of cynically, isn't the high cost of education and of synagogue attendance, synagogue membership, a form of Jewish birth control? Yeah. Another is putting the emphasis on rural and like Jewish communities, wouldn't making conversion and interfaith marriage more accessible allow more people to be Jews and live Jewishly? Many rural Jewish children in North America don't have access to traditional Jewish education, regardless of their class or background. So I'm not sure that focusing on this traditional model is the answer.
All right. So it is definitely the case that within the Jewish community, that our commitment to education, both secular and Jewish, is which we very effectively transfer that into, to the next generation. Hence the statistics I mentioned before about the rate of Jews that go to college and graduate school and all of that, right? By the way, just so you know, it's about 30% of Americans who have a BA degree. Generally, it's about 75% of Jews who have a BA degree or beyond, right? So if anything, the disparity increases at the college level over the high school level, and that does mean that people who are very heavily involved in their studies are more likely and wanting careers that are more likely to postpone marriage and engage, and therefore often have these infertility, more often than otherwise would have these infertility problems. By the way, you can be infertile in your teens. It's just that age is a major factor in infertility as one grows older. In terms of interfaith marriages, or I mentioned Jews by choice, that we really have to be much more open to than classically has been the case. Classically, rabbis were supposed to refuse somebody who wanted to become Jewish 3 times before they even began working with them. At least I certainly do not do that, and I don't think any conservative rabbi does that. I don't know what happens. I would imagine in the Orthodox world that probably still happens. But I think that's really counterproductive, literally, that we really do need to encourage people who want to convert to us. Whether we should missionize or not is another question. Rabbi Alex Schindler, alav shalom, who was the president of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, that's what it was called at the time, back in the 70s, I think, said that we should missionize. And Rabbi Harold Schulweis, alav shalom, also thought that we should in the conservative movement. Whether we should or not is another issue, but we certainly should be more open to conversions. And in terms of interfaith couples, I think we really need to be much more open to outreach to them and to their children, and an attempt to try to convince the non-Jew to raise their children as Jewish, or at least, and maybe even later on, that the non-Jew would convert to Judaism as well. We've got to be much more open to that and much more aggressive about those efforts. Whether to officiate at the wedding of a Jew to a non-Jew, that's a major issue in my movement. It's not allowed. Let me just say straight out, it's not allowed for rabbis in the conservative movement to officiate at the wedding of a Jew to a non-Jew. whether it statistically helps in terms of, sorry, in terms of our demographic problems, is a matter at issue, actually. And I think, I mean, you have to talk to sociologists here. I'm not one, but at least the last that I read, it's not completely clear that that really will help. But on the other hand, I'm not a sociologist, so you have to go elsewhere for that.
A couple of questions about sort of.
Oh, by the way, excuse me, one other thing. Sure. One thing for rural couples that is really very good is the fact that we now have the internet and all kinds of Jewish studies that are available on the internet at all kinds of levels. And so, I mean, I think that one of the things that we really need to take advantage of much more, especially for, I have a former student of mine who became a kind of traveling rabbi for some communities in the South, rural communities in the South. And one of the things that he really did was to make a lot of use of what's available on the internet for both the adults and the children in those communities. So, I mean, I think that's something that we really need to take advantage of.
Yeah, when you made this last comment, I was thinking about Southern Jewish experience as well. And I assume he was a roving rabbi for that, and they are indeed doing amazing work for small communities in the South. Okay, so there are a couple of questions about sort of procedures and practices. One is, what is the Jewish view of surrogacy, where women's own physical health issues preclude a safe pregnancy? And the other is about in vitro fertilization. Given your focus on procreation, how does Jewish law play in the impact of the new ruling and state laws on in vitro fertilization?
Okay, well, let me take the latter first. In vitro fertilization has been around ever since 1978. In England was the first one. And I happened to be in England for a conference of the Jewish Law Association about 30 years later. And on the front page of the London Times was the fact that that woman had just given birth to her first child, conceived in the usual way. There are something like over 1 million people on the face of the earth today that have been conceived through in vitro fertilization. From a Jewish perspective, if we're talking about the easy case, if we're talking about the husband's sperm and the woman's and the wife's egg, and they need to do in vitro fertilization, typically to get around blockages in the fallopian tubes in the woman, but there can be some other medical reasons as well, then there's no problem with that whatsoever, right? As if anything, thank God for that new procedure, so that couples that would otherwise be not able to have children are now able to have children. It gets more complicated when you're talking about donor sperm and donor eggs. And if you want, well, I'll be completely crass about this. I wrote this book called Matters of Life and Death, the Jewish Approach to Modern Medical Ethics. And there's a long section there on donor sperm and donor eggs and what that means and all of that. All of that was originally part of a rabbinic ruling that I did for the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. There are two other rabbis who wrote about surrogacy in the conservative movement, both of which would, one of which would accept it reluctantly. When I'm talking about, there are two different kinds of surrogacy, right? There's gestational surrogacy, that is where the woman cannot carry, right? Where the man and the woman of a couple, so far I'm talking about heterosexual couples, we'll get to gay couples in a moment, but let's say the man and the woman in a heterosexual couple have viable sperm and eggs, but she cannot carry the child, right? So that's called, and another woman is willing to be impregnated with their zygote, with their fertilized egg, right, and carry the child, right? In which case, the vast majority of the DNA of the child will be that of the couple whose sperm and eggs created it, right? That's been around only since 1978. Long ago, there has been traditional surrogacy, or what's called ovum surrogacy. That goes back to the patriarchs and matriarchs of our tradition, right? Where the woman who provides the egg is also the woman who carries the child, but the man's sperm of the couple comes from the sperm that is used comes from the man in the couple, right? So that kind of ovum surrogacy is also allowed, however, at least within the conservative movement. But what it means, at least for us until now, is that if the surrogate is not Jewish, and the vast majority of surrogate women, the women who are surrogate mothers, are not Jewish, if the woman is not Jewish, then the child needs to be converted. Now, being converted at birth is not a major issue, but it basically is that if it's a boy, then you can, and the boy is healthy, you can circumcise the boy on the 8th day as you would otherwise. And then you can wait until the child is, whether a boy or a girl, can wait until the child is used to a bath and take the child to the mikvah 3 or 4 months after birth, right? And having been converted to Judaism, it means that the child cannot be a king. That doesn't matter very much these days, but which is interesting, by the way. It's parallel to American law that you cannot be president unless you're born in this country, right? If you're an immigrant in this country, you can be a full citizen except for that. And similarly, in Jewish law, if you're a convert to Judaism, you cannot be king. And there are issues if you're talking if the father happens to be a Kohen or a Levi, that doesn't get passed down. But and as a matter of fact, right now on the table of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Conservative Movement is a tshuva by Rabbi Judith Hauptman, and by a woman lawyer who is very much involved in this, where it was in exactly this case. It was her egg and her husband's sperm that were used to create the child, but she cannot carry the child. They actually were able to have a child the usual way the first time around, but this time cannot. And she is really pushing us to try to say that the child could be Jewish by birth if the delivering mother is Jewish, or if the sperm and eggs come from Jews. What will happen with that tshuva, I don't know. But it's and by the way, this is an issue in the Orthodox world as well. In Israel in particular, it's a lot of debates as to whether, what determines the Jewish identity of the child. But in any case, surrogacy is allowed for couples who cannot get pregnant in any other way.
I was going to close now, but Steve Greenberg raised an intriguing question, and I think it'll be maybe great if we close on on his question. But before that, just two participants commented on the point of law, suggesting that it is actually the requirement that the candidate for presidency is born a citizen, not necessarily in the US. But that can be checked afterwards. And
there were all kinds of questions about with Romney. You remember that? Who Governor Romney at the time was born in Mexico. If you're born in a U.S. base outside the United States, then that counts as being born in the United States. But at least as the shot of the Constitution is that.
All right, that's beyond our discussion of abortion.
Okay,
so let me read Steve Greenberg's two questions. One, women aren't duty bound to procreate. Doesn't that make a difference here? And two, how should Jews interact with a radical polarization in the US, which doesn't do nuance? The liberal response to the issue focuses on individual rights. The right sees termination of life after conception as murder. How might we move to the discourse in the US toward a more balanced Jewish frame of reference?
Okay. Thank you, Steve. Hi. Hello there. It's been a while. We are a very small Jewish community after all. So yes, according to traditional Jewish law, it's the man who has the duty to procreate, not the woman. Obviously, the man cannot do so without the woman. And so the question is, well, why why is it that only the man is obligated? The legal reason is because Pruervu comes with and right? Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and conquer it. And so what the rabbi said, who conquers the world? It's the men. And so therefore only the men are responsible at the beginning. But that's just the legal reason. The real question is, what's the real reason why they would have done it this way? I mean, after it's all said and done, the shot of that first chapter in Genesis is to both the man and the woman. Hold on, this is my phone man. Hi, I'm still involved in this. I'll be with you in just a minute, okay? Are you outside? Good. Okay, I will. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye. Having trouble with our pool. What can I tell you? Anyway, and this is not, all right. Anyway, so I think the real reasons are, number one, that especially in the ancient world, but even in the modern world, pregnancy involves risks. And so consequently, they did not want the woman to be obligated to undergo those risks. And I think the second reason is that, at least in traditional Jewish law, it was the man who was going to have to support his children financially. And so it was the man who had to be obligated against his financial benefit to have children. I think those are the real reasons behind the reason why the rabbis interpreted that verse, frankly, counterintuitively, and certainly counter-contextually. And that said, after it's all said and done, I mean, anybody with half a brain understands that this really needs to be, a communal decision. That is the marital community, that is the man and the woman together, have to decide to do this. And by the way, true for gay and lesbian people as well, right? I mean, it's because after it's all said and done, having children, my wife and I have 4 of them, having children is not only a matter of procreation, it's very much a matter of being there for them as they are growing up. And that requires a lot of time, energy, money, you name it, right? And so that really is the major obligation of having children. It's not only having the children, it's being able to raise them and all of that. And so it really does need to be a mutual decision. In terms of remind me of the second. Oh yeah, yes, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I would hope, frankly, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Republicans and Democrats were able to work together on all kinds of legislation, including even the Civil Rights Act of 1964, believe it or not, and the Voting Rights Act, right? I mean, even that kind of stuff, right? And it's and I would hope that the kind of nuanced position that I described to you in terms of the Jewish tradition would become more the norm in America today, right? We are more divided in America today on all kinds of issues, with all kinds of conspiracy theories about the other side. That is just really frightening, I must say, about the unity of the American people and the ability to function as a nation. You can't do that if you're screaming at each other, you don't trust each other, and you don't respect each other. And I must say, one of the things, I'll leave it to Steve to talk about the Orthodox movement and to others, right? But one of the things I'm most proud of in the conservative movement is that even when we have had the most contentious issues in front of us, the place of women back in the 70s and 80s, gay and lesbian Jews, right? It was never, I mean, I'll just talk about the gay and lesbian, the process of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the conservative movement dealing with that issue. It was never, there were very heated debates, but they were never personal. It was never, you're crazy, you're stupid, or whatever. It was always on point. And I think that kind of mutual respect that I found, thankfully, within my movement on even these most controversial issues, it really needs to be a model for America generally.
Well, just add Israel as well. Your last statements, if I replaced America with Israel, I think you would be describing quite accurately and painfully some of the realities that we face here in the political and social discourse. So with the happy note of what you prescribed, and the troubling note of what happens in the legal and the political arena will end. I want to remind everybody again that in 2 weeks, Monday, same time, the 25th, Professor Noya Rimalt will share with us the legal perspective of the abortion decision and make some comparisons between the state of affairs in Israel and how all of that impacts on women especially and gender equality. Elliot, you have been as wonderful as always, and just you are setting such a high standard and you just don't move any lower. So I can't say it was better than before. It's wonderful. So thank you, and we have learned a lot, both on the topic of abortion in Jewish tradition, and you gave us a lot to think about in terms of social policies and Jewish social policies. So toda rabba and leitraot. Shalom to you all. We'll send you a follow-up email in a few days with the link to the recording, and I'll ask Elliot to provide us with the position paper that he wrote. Shalom and leitraot.